In the quiet valleys of Tennessee, where mist clings to the hollows and secrets sink deeper than roots, there is one story that locals never tell outright. It is whispered instead, half swallowed in churchyards and on porches, the words spoken only when strangers aren't listening. The story of a bride who stood at the altar not with a stranger, not even with a distant cousin, but with her own father's brother. The town records mark it simply as a marriage in 1914, filed like any other. A single license, one faded signature. From the county clerk, nothing that would draw the eye. Yet behind that piece of paper lay a truth so disturbing that families buried it under silence for over a century. A girl barely past childhood, carrying her mother's eyes and her father's last name, was promised to the man who had once held her as a baby, her uncle, her father's blood. Witnesses said the wedding was not celebrated but endured. The church doors stayed shut. No bells rang. Only a handful of relatives attended, faces pale, eyes lowered. Some claimed they heard the girl's mother weeping in the back pew. Others swore the preacher hesitated, stammering before forcing the words through his teeth. But the vows were spoken. And with them, a new line of inbreeding began. A line that would echo through the hills with children who bore the weight of that union, and neighbors who could never look at the family the same way again. This was no accident. It was a choice, a pact to keep the blood close, tighter than the law, tighter than morality. And it was only the beginning. The county courthouse where the marriage was written down has long since changed hands. Dust covers the ledgers, their spines cracked, their ink faded. But if you know where to look, the truth can still be traced. Pages reveal a tangle of names, repeating across generations, surnames that never left, children born under fathers and mothers who were, at times, the same age, and often siblings themselves. The license that united the uncle and his niece was not an exception. It was part of a pattern, an unspoken ritual whispered from one generation to the next. Neighbors remembered how the family appeared in census records, then disappeared again. In some years, children were listed with no clear parentage. Unclear relation, one census taker scrawled, his pen digging so hard into the paper that the ink bled through. Entire households were marked and then crossed out, as if someone, whether clerk or family, wanted the confusion to remain, names repeated like a curse. The same first names passed down, the same middle initials recycled, until even the government's records could not tell who belonged to whom. School teachers in those years faced a quiet nightmare. Children would arrive at the one-room schoolhouse, small and frail, their skin pale, their eyes too wide and strangely vacant. When asked their parents' names, they would hesitate. Some gave two answers, both uncle and father, both aunt and mother. The teachers did not write this down. Instead, they passed notes between themselves, warning replacements what questions not to ask. One teacher wrote, "The children know something, but they've been told not to speak. Their silence frightens me more than their words ever could." That note was later destroyed by the superintendent, but its memory stayed alive among the valley's older families. Behind the curtain of official silence, whispers spread. A woman who lived on the edge of the family's land claimed she once helped deliver a child who should not have survived. The baby's limbs were too thin, its head too large for its body, its cries sharp and unnatural. The mother, herself no older than 15, sat silent, her hair hanging over her face, refusing to look at the infant. The woman swore the child did not live long, and by morning it was gone. She asked where the body had been laid, but no grave was shown to her. "We keep our own," the uncle said, his voice flat. She never returned to the cabin again. The deeper you look into the records, the more disappearances you find. Birth certificates filed and then retracted. Children baptized, but never listed in county rolls. Some names were scratched out in heavy black ink, others written faintly in pencil, as if someone had meant to erase them later. One county clerk, who handled the family's paperwork for decades, later confessed on his deathbed, "We were told not to ask, told not to dig. Some of those papers were meant to burn, and when the courthouse fire came, it burned just what needed to be gone. Yet the fire could not destroy memory." Locals told each other stories in hushed tones, of children who all looked too alike, their faces blurred by the same blood. One family living nearby claimed that on certain nights they could see lantern light flickering from the cabin windows, but no laughter, no music, no sign of joy. Only shadows moving back and forth, the silence pressing heavier than the dark itself. Even preachers avoided the family's land. One itinerant pastor wrote in his journal that he had been invited once, in the early 1920s, to bless a new baby. He found the mother lying in bed, pale and wordless, her face turned to the wall. The child lay in a cradle nearby, eyes wide open, unblinking, its skin almost translucent. The pastor said he muttered a prayer, left a Bible on the table, and never returned. His entry ended with 4 words underlined 3 times: "The blood is wrong." This was the reality of the uncle's marriage to his niece. It was never about love, never about family as most would understand it. It was about control, about keeping bloodlines tighter and tighter until every branch curved inward, forming not a tree but a circle. And within that circle, children were born into silence, into confusion, into bodies marked by the choices of those who came before them. The official records might have blurred, and some may have burned, but the valley remembered. The land carried whispers, and the faces of the children, pale, identical and strangely silent, told a truth no one dared speak aloud. The uncle's marriage to his niece was not an ending. It was the beginning of something far darker. From their union came children, and from those children came more. For generations, the cabin on the edge of the Tennessee hills was less a home than a breeding ground, where silence grew thicker than the smoke curling from its chimney. Neighbors claimed they rarely saw the children outside. On rare afternoons, when a figure appeared at the edge of the property, it was always small, thin, and strangely stiff. One woman said she once glimpsed a girl no older than 10, staring out from behind a warped wooden shutter. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open, her eyes far too large for her head. When the girl realized she was being watched, she didn't hide. She simply closed the curtain with a slow, deliberate motion, as though rehearsed. The woman swore she heard a man's voice behind her afterward, low, commanding, final. Inside the cabin, silence was a rule. The children were taught not to speak to outsiders, not to share what happened in those dimly lit rooms. Teachers, when they tried to question them, found the children evasive or eerily blank. One teacher remembered a boy, about 12 years old, who could write his name but refused to read aloud. When she pressed him, his voice broke in a rasp and he whispered, "I'm not supposed to." She wrote it down in her logbook. The entry was later crossed out in thick black ink by the superintendent, but silence could not hide what the body revealed. Many of the children were born with bent spines, jawbones too narrow for their faces, or eyes that seemed to drift in opposite directions. A visiting doctor in the 1930s noted physical defects of unknown cause in his private notes, though he dared not report them officially. "If I write the truth," he said to his nurse, "the county will bury me before they bury them." His nurse later recalled that some of the children never walked upright, their knees turning inward, their steps shuffling like the elderly, though they were no older than 6. Other children bore wounds that were not visible to the eye but to the spirit. They moved like shadows, obedient, fearful, almost mechanical. When spoken to, they flinched. When touched, they froze. A preacher who once delivered food to the family during a harsh winter recalled the children sitting in a row along the wall, bowls in hand, eyes fixed on their father-uncle as he entered the room. They waited for him to speak before they took a single bite, the preacher wrote. Not one of them moved until he lifted his own spoon. It was as though they were puppets, not children. The uncle's control was absolute. Those who broke. The silence did not last long. A rumor spread that one daughter, grown into her teenage years, had tried to run. She was said to have been seen barefoot on the road, her face gaunt, her dress torn. A farmer who offered her water swore she spoke only one sentence: "He is both." When he asked what she meant, she burst into tears and fled back into the woods. Days later, neighbors noticed a freshly dug mound near the cabin. No one asked who lay beneath it. The children's deformities grew more pronounced with each generation. Hollow cheeks, unnaturally wide eyes, bodies too fragile for labor. Yet they were put to work in the fields and in the house. Some neighbors whispered that the family purposely kept them hidden when visitors came, locking them in upstairs rooms until the danger passed. On stormy nights, however, screams were heard, thin, piercing cries that echoed through the valley. Animal sounds, one man described. But others, who listened longer, said they were human. Children calling for help in voices too weak to be heard beyond the trees. Perhaps the most chilling detail came from a midwife who once assisted at a birth inside the cabin. She said the infant she delivered never cried. Its eyes were open, its skin waxy and pale, its chest rising and falling without sound. When she asked to examine the baby more closely, the uncle stepped between her and the cradle. His niece-wife, exhausted and bleeding, whispered something the midwife never forgot. "It happens every time." By morning, the cradle was empty. The midwife swore she was escorted out and told never to return. The children of this family were not raised to live ordinary lives. They were born into confusion, forced to call their fathers uncle, their mother's sister, and sometimes both at once. They grew up knowing their roles before they had voices to question them. Some became wives to their own blood. Some never lived long enough to speak. And yet, the cycle continued, unbroken, because silence was stronger than rebellion. The mid-20th century, the children were known throughout the valley only by rumor. They all looked the same. One teacher whispered, "They have one face, one voice, one silence." The family's cabin became a place people avoided, even in daylight. Travelers who lost their way on the mountain swore they saw children, standing motionless by the tree line, staring but never waving, their pale faces blank in the shadow. Those travelers never lingered long enough to see if the children moved. The truth of the children's lives was never fully written down. It lived in whispers, in unmarked graves, in the memories of those few who dared step close enough to see. And through them, the story of the uncle and his niece, the marriage that should never have been, grew into something larger, something far more terrifying. It was no longer just about two people. It was about generations caught in a cycle of silence, fear, and deformity. A cycle that the land itself seemed unwilling to forget. By the mid-20th century, the cabin that once held Tennessee's darkest secret was no longer just a place of whispers. It had become a scar on the land itself. The family had survived for generations in silence, but silence cannot hold forever. Something, whether from within or without, would eventually break. And when it did, it came not as mercy, but as fire. Neighbors recalled that by the 1950s, the cabin leaned under its own weight. The wood was warped, the shutters rotting, the roof patched with tin scraps that clattered in storms. But though the house was failing, the family remained inside, locked away as always. No children attended school, no names were entered in church rolls. No marriages were filed in the courthouse. And yet, smoke still rose from the chimney, proof that the cycle of life inside, however twisted, continued. The first outsider to sound an alarm was a social worker. Sent by the county after reports of screaming at night, she climbed the ridge one grey afternoon. She later described the walk as like entering another century, the path overgrown, the silence pressing in like a weight. When she reached the cabin, she found 3 girls on the porch, all heavy with pregnancy, though none appeared older than 16. They stared at her with hollow eyes, their expressions unreadable, their swollen bellies undeniable. Inside, she met an older man in his 60s, the patriarch of the line. His face was sharp, his jaw thin, his eyes pale. He did not deny the pregnancies. He did not explain. He only said, "They are mine to care for." The report she filed was brief, clinical, stripped of the horror she had seen. Possible incest, severe neglect. But even those sparse words carried danger. Days after her visit, the cabin caught fire. Locals awoke to the smell of smoke drifting through the valley. By the time men reached the ridge, the house was a skeleton of flames. The roof had collapsed. The porch where the girls once stood was gone. The fire burned too hot, too fast, as though fed by more than wood. When the flames died, nothing remained but ash and blackened timbers. No bodies were recovered. Officials said perhaps the family had perished in the blaze, their remains consumed, but neighbors told a different story. Some swore they saw figures slipping into the woods that night, thin silhouettes with long hair, faces pale in the firelight vanishing into the trees. If true, it meant the bloodline had not ended in the fire. It had scattered, escaping into shadows deeper than before. The fire itself was never officially investigated. Some said it was an accident, a lamp overturned in the night. Others whispered it was no accident at all, that someone had set it deliberately, either to end the cycle or to erase the evidence. A few accused the county itself, suggesting the flames were a convenient way to cleanse records, to silence rumors, to destroy proof. The truth was buried in the ash, alongside generations of unmarked graves. But not everything burned. Weeks later, a hunter stumbled across the family's burial. Ground in the woods, the graves were shallow, the markers crude or long since rotted away. Some mounds were so small they could only have held infants. The hunter claimed he saw bones exposed by rain, tiny skulls with sockets too wide, spines curved like broken branches. He fled, refusing to speak of it again, yet the whispers spread. The graves became part of the story, evidence of children who had lived and died without names, without records, without mercy. The collapse of the house marked the end of the family as neighbors had known it. The cabin was never rebuilt. The land grew wild, swallowing the remains. Outsiders stopped asking questions, relieved perhaps that the place was gone. But the memory lingered, stronger for the fire that tried to erase it. And those who believed they saw figures fleeing into the woods never forgot. Some claimed they saw pale faces at the tree line years later, watching, silent, then vanishing back into the dark. Others said descendants had moved into nearby towns, carrying the same sharp features, the same hollow eyes, blending into a world that never knew what lay in their blood. The fire did not end the story. It only scattered it, like embers carried on the wind, burning unseen in places no one dares to look too closely. And in those embers, the secret of Tennessee's most forbidden marriage lived on. After the fire of the 1950s, the county was eager to close the book on the family of the Ridge. No investigation followed, no arrests, no autopsies. The courthouse kept no record of the marriages, and the church rolls contained only gaps where names should have been. It was as if the family had never existed. For officials, that was easier. Erase the evidence, and the shame of Tennessee's darkest secret might fade into the past. But secrets do not burn as cleanly as houses. For decades afterward, fragments of the story surfaced like bones rising through shallow soil. A farmer clearing his land found a child's shoe buried in clay, smaller than his fist. A school teacher remembered children arriving barefoot and vanishing again after only weeks, their faces pale, their speech strange, their names never repeated. A doctor in the 1970s claimed he delivered infants with deformities that reminded him of something ancient, something already whispered about in these hills. And then there were the sightings. Hikers spoke of hearing voices deep in the trees, high-pitched, laughter that cut off suddenly when they drew near. Hunters claimed to glimpse shapes watching from the ridgeline. Thin figures, faces too pale, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Whether it was imagination, paranoia, or blood that had survived the fire, no one could say for certain. Genealogists, who traced families in the region, occasionally stumbled on patterns that made their hands tremble. Branches that bent back on themselves, fathers listed as uncles, mothers who were also cousins, dates that overlapped in impossible ways. But the deeper they dug, the more resistance they met. Records were missing, graves unmarked, stories cut short. Neighbors grew quiet when asked. "Best not stir that ground," one elderly woman told a researcher in 1991. "Roots like that don't stay buried." Today, the ridge where the cabin once stood is overgrown, reclaimed by forest, yet some locals still avoid it, swearing that animals will not graze there, that the soil itself feels wrong. And from time to time, a stranger passes through a nearby town with features that make old-timers glance twice. The sharp jaw, the pale eyes, the look of someone carrying more than just their own history. Tennessee's darkest secret may never be fully uncovered. Too much was burned, too much erased, too much buried. But like smoke that clings long after the fire dies, the memory endures. It lingers in the land, in the whispers of families who refuse to speak, and perhaps in the blood of descendants who still walk among us, never knowing the full truth of where they came from. Because some stories don't end, they hide, and some bloodlines don't die, they endure.